This is the one, right? नहीं नहीं कुछ CSSC 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 like this yes ISI oh this yes. Mhm. Yes. That's it. Yeah. ठीक है ऐसी फिलोसफी मेरा है इनके अन्य ऑडियो जब सुनेंगे तो ऑडियो जब हटाएंगे then you can able to unmute that system otherwise it will unmute इसका फिर वही फिर वीडियो नहीं आएगा यूट्यूब में ये तो आ रहा है ये आएगा स्क्रीन शेयर वो हम लोग का वीडियो नहीं आएगा वो कैमरा का वीडियो वहां पर रिकॉर्ड होगा ना वो जो शेयर नहीं होगा जो यूट्यूब लाइव में ये तो ऑलरेडी शेयर कर रहे हैं बहुत लोग ये वहाँ हाँ ये तो जस्ट गेट कम बैक नहीं जैसे आप बोलोगे ना हाँ अच्छा विद माय ऑडियो नो जैसे व्हेन यू आर स्टार्ट स्पीकिंग हाँ इसका वो शो नहीं लगेगा लाइक इसका वीडियो साउंड नहीं विदाउट सिर्फ ओनली स्क्रीन शेयर meaning my face will not yes. Only the audio and then the slides. Audio and slides. Whatever you usually do. Or you want to change something? No, we are seeing the we will made that setup to be on that laptop. We want to be then I have to remove this jack. Okay. Go to show some music. No? There is one place where it's audio. So there's something when you change the computer, it becomes like. Acha, we need this audio jack. Change some it. At that time only. Once it is done, the interruption. It will be told. Here I can just click. Oh, I see. Because this laptop will because it will start equal. Okay. Let it. Okay, you decide. Let it be like this. Once. ये तो लास्ट में आए ये बिगिनिंग में तो नहीं लास्ट में आए तो इसके बाद हम इसको कनेक्ट कर देंगे दैट्स ओके शो दैट इज वो हो जाएगा उसको भी निकाल के कैन रिमूव एंड देन नेक्स्ट वन द यू कैन 11 नंबर बंद कर दो हाँ तो यहाँ पे म्यूट कर दो ठीक है
Speak Arun from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and I would request Professor Deepthi Prashad Mukherjee from the Indian Statistical Institute to please come on stage and chair the session for us.
Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for this session, Professor S.P. Arun. He's from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and he's also heading, I guess, the Center for Neuroscience currently. I was trying for some time to find out what SP stands for, what I couldn't, but then I have the brief resume of Professor Arun, and you get rest assured that here is a recipe how to be a successful neuroscientist. Because he said that he started as an electrical engineer and then read too much of science fiction and then turned into a neuroscientist. So now you know how to become a neuroscientist. But other than that, he has a very checkered career. He did his bachelor's from IIT Bombay, and then I guess both masters and PhD from Johns Hopkins, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at the Carnegie Mellon. And in particular, the title of the talk is Improving Machine Vision Using Insights from Neuroscience. So 2 lines is very interesting to all of us, maybe those who are listening to this talk. He said that he's going to derive insight into why deep networks work and how they can be improved. So I'm sure most of us will look forward to this talk, especially to know the answers of these questions. Thank you and welcome once again, Professor Arun.
Can you hear me? So thank you, Professor Mukherjee, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me here. This will be very different from the material that you've been hearing at this conference. So I guess hopefully you'll get some of the basics and you'll sort of share the excitement I have for this kind of neuroscience. So let's get right to it. So this is okay, yeah. So I want to start off with this sort of paradox, which someone yesterday also was noting, which is that we all find that today computers can perform millions of calculations much faster than us. They can play chess, they can do certain things much better than us, and actually often those are the things that are actually hard for us to do. So any kind of numerical calculation, it's like hard and effortful for us. But actually it's the things that we do without thinking that are actually turning out to be really hard for to replicate in computers. So for example, the simple act of seeing, hearing, moving, touching objects, picking up objects, these are actually turning out to be the hard questions. And that became really fascinating for me when I started out studying electrical engineering, and I started looking at image processing, and I was fascinated by AI and robotics back in the day. And then I quickly realized that it's all these very basic things that robots are not able to do, and that's the reason why we don't see robots coexisting or in the world around us. So then the question is, how does one of these problems work? I got really interested in vision and sort of stuck to it because it remained fascinating. I continue to find it fascinating. So this is our lab at IISC, and really the motivation for understanding this comes from the very simplest of visual tasks that we find that computers are not able to do. We're not able to program computers to do simple letter recognition, simple just interpret what's in the scene and things like that. They're getting better, but still humans are much better than any in the existing AI algorithm. So then the question is, how is our brain doing it? And we do a number of different experiments in our lab to understand this, to address this question. So we do a number of experiments with human participants. We bring people into our lab, we make them do behavioral experiments. We also take them to MRI scanners, image the brain activity in their brain, trying to understand how visual processing happens in the brain. More recently, we've been looking at how visual processing happens when you learn to read, how visual processing changes, how you process letters of the scripts that you know. And even more recently, we have an ongoing study looking at perception in autism and ADHD and how that is different from neurotypical populations. So that's the human experiments. We also do animal experiments in our lab. And here the goal is to understand the visual processing in the brain at a very micro level, at the level of single neurons. And so we have our model system is the monkey, whose visual system is very similar to ours. They see like us. They behave in many ways. We behave like them, and they behave like us. And so it's worth understanding what happens inside the brain at a very micro level. Those are the experiments that we do. So that's a broad overview of what we do in our lab. I'm going to start with a sort of historical throwback. which is from credited to Douglas Hofstadter, where he basically says, there are two hard problems of AI. This is in his book called Metamagical Themas. Really nice book. I got really inspired by it. And basically, he says there are two hard problems of AI. And the two hard problems of AI are what is A and then what is I. And I'll tell you what that means in a second. But in the Indian context, we know that there is no I because the Indian philosophers have had it. And so really the only central question is what is A? Of course, I'm joking a little bit. And what Douglas Hofstadter goes on to say is that when you look at the letter A, he's literally talking about what is A, the letter A. And what he basically says is that when you look at this letter A in many different styles, there's no sort of fundamental similarity between those pixel patterns. But we understand the essence of that letter A, and in a sense we understand A-ness, so to speak. And we are able to generalize. So you can teach a child a couple of fonts. They don't need to see all the possible fonts of the letter A before they start recognizing. And so we have an incredible capacity to generalize across the categories we learn. We need very few examples to learn. We know that, for example, machine vision algorithms need thousands and thousands of examples to learn, but that's not the case for a child. In fact, the child is actually getting very few labeled examples. They're just learning a lot of structure and properties of world in a very unsupervised manner. Okay, so that's the challenge of sort of what is A. And what I'll try to tell you about is how does the brain solve vision? And that's really where I've spent many years trying to investigate this problem. I don't think we're anywhere close to understanding how the brain is solving vision. And that's partly because even for the brain, vision is a really hard problem. And the reason, the evidence for this, for the fact that the brain finds this really hard is by the fact that this is actually, by the way, the monkey brain. Their brain is very similar to ours. And both in the monkey and human brain, the number of visual regions, that is, number of regions that process visual information is very, very large. Almost half your brain is actually dedicated to visual processing of some kind of it. And if you imagine the amount of area that is occupied by the retina in your body, it's a very, very small fraction of the body. And so it doesn't deserve this much attention, except for the fact that vision is in fact a hard problem. It's a fascinating problem. It's one of the only senses that allow us to interpret very, very far away objects and distances and so on. So it's a very important sensory modality for all of us. So in the brain, there's a number of different brain regions that process visual information, and part of our challenge is to unpack all the visual processing that's happening in the brain to be able to understand the functional components and the algorithms and the computations that happen. Right? So what do we want to do here? So well, what I would say is that there needs to be a dialogue between neuroscience and machine, between AI and ML and neuroscience. And that's partly because, in fact, there has been a dialogue of some kind, because even historically, the observation of having Gabor-like receptacles in the visual system inspired sort of Gabor-like, Gabor-based image processing on the computer vision side. So there's been always some kind of dialogue. And ML and AI researchers have always looked to the brain for inspiration. And so there's been a sort of dialogue. And so what is the benefit of having this dialogue? I would say that the benefits are many. One is that we can understand the brain through AI. What I mean by that is that perhaps if we have better AI algorithms, if their performance matches what humans are doing, then potentially we can interrogate these systems better and then potentially understand what the brain is doing better, because something is going right, their performance is matching what humans are doing. And especially if you look at if you get a very close correspondence between what an AI algorithm does and what humans are doing, then you can potentially say that the underlying computations are very similar. Okay, so that's one way. The other direction of the dialogue is maybe we can improve AI algorithms using brains, which is probably what many of you are interested in doing. But again, there the question is, if you can understand how the brain is solving some tasks, then maybe we can copy that process or computation or algorithms and then bring it into an AI algorithms and improve performance. So I'm going to show you some examples of how we've been trying to go back and forth. By no means this is settled and answered area. I think there's a lot of potential in this area. We are also looking for people to join us in investigating some of these things, and there's a lot of scope in this field in general. So
So I've talked to you about all of these, so I'm just going to skip that, and I'm going to start off by saying, okay, let's look at the problem of vision itself. One very obvious problem that we are all able to solve is object detection. That is, you look at an object and you know what it is. And so if you start looking at how the brain and image processing algorithms solve these problems, it turns out that there's a very similar workflow. So here's okay. So here's an image. Okay. And so the image is now in a typical AI or ML processing pipeline. Essentially, what you're doing is to extract some image features. Then you pass it to a classifier. All of this, all of you know. And then you get some label for that particular image, and you understand the object present in the image. Now, if you do the same thing for a human brain or for a human being, then here's another image. And so basically here the information from the eyes goes to the brain, and basically there's a region in the brain which is in the back of your head, which is the visual cortex where information is processed, and there's some kind of feature extraction that we know is happening. And then if you ask a person to make a response based on the image, then they'll typically use some region in the prefrontal cortex to actually execute the task. That is, you told them some instruction, they're remembering the instruction in their head, and they're producing a label. And then I have said this sacrilegious thing that this is now labeled as a god, and that is amazing. Okay, and so what we actually want to do in understanding this workflow is to say, okay, well, let's take an AI algorithm, and I'll take a human participant, and I can compare their performance. And that's one way of going about it. And actually, we've done some studies where we try to just compare the performance of AI algorithms with humans. But there's one issue, because if you give a very, very easy task, then both the AI algorithm and the human is going to do this at 100%. So we're not going to be able to distinguish or compare their performance in any meaningful way. It's a bit like saying that you have a very, very easy exam. And so if I gave you an exam on just 2-digit multiplication, all of us will ace it. And so we won't really know the underlying strategies and computation. So really what you want to do is to compare humans and AI on a kind of equivalent and hard task. Okay, and this is a little bit of a challenge because people are really good at object detection. So if you ask them to make detect objects like people in a scene and so on, they're actually at 100%. So how do you make a task which is sort of hard for a human being as well as hard for a computer vision algorithm? So the problem that we actually set up to do is the problem of actually face recognition. It's actually something that all of us actually do quite frequently, and it was motivated. So it's this work done by Harish, who was a postdoc in the lab. And basically the problem that we decided to set up is completely based on curiosity about something that we observed around us. And this refers to the fact that all of us, when we look at people from different parts of India, you're usually able to tell, like, okay, this person looks like they're from North India, this person looks like they're from the South. Sometimes you can even localize, like, say, this person looks like they're from Tamil Nadu, that person looks like they're from Bengal, and so on. There's lots of localizations that we're able to do just by looking at the face of the person. Of course, if you have accent and language that is spoken by the person, you can narrow down even better. But the point is that even looking at the face, people make these instant judgments about how someone is coming from this part of India, right? So we're just curious about this problem. So what we decided to do is to actually check how well can people actually do this task. And so this is just our definitions. I apologize if I'm offending any of you by this categorization, but we sort of chose people who are coming from these regions of India. And so we went out into the field. We actually took people, approached people on the street, took photos with their consent, and then we asked them the region that they're coming from and the region that their parents are coming from. So we kind of validated this data set that these are people who are truly belonging to those regions. Of course, it doesn't matter where they're actually currently staying, it matters where they're actually from or where their parents are. So here are some examples. This is actually, and then so we created a database of Indian faces. This database is actually available publicly on our website. And so on this database of Indian faces, we then took this database and then showed it to an independent set of people. And we confirmed that these people didn't know they're people who were photographed. So these are completely separate populations of people. And so then we asked these people to categorize these faces as belonging to the northern regions of India or versus the southern region. That's the task. And so what is shown here as a performance number is the faces for these faces. These faces are categorized to almost very high performance by all the subjects in our experiment. So everybody in this experiment, regardless of whether they're from north or south regions or whatever region, they were able to categorize these spaces as very accurately as belonging to those regions. Okay. But we also saw a range of performance. So in other words, if you look at the faces on the leftmost column, whether they were male or female, there was a set of faces which were actually not recognized by you. And so these were actually misclassified in the opposite category. Okay, but the point is that overall, if you look at the performance of human subjects on this task, they're about 65%, which means that it's a hard task for all of us. Not everyone is able to do it. And there is a systematic variation in the ability to detect and recognize faces across the population and across faces. Okay. So what are we going to do with this? Well, we have the baseline performance of human subjects on this task. And now we want to compare what computer vision algorithms can do and whether their error patterns are the same or not. Okay, so ultimately what we're interested in knowing is, are the features extracted by computer vision systems when they train to recognize faces, are those features the same as what humans are using? Okay, so that was the basic question. And so how do we do this? Well, one approach is of course take a deep network. And here, of course, we won't know which regions in the face are actually being used. So one of what we wanted to do is to also use another method where we're extracting features from different parts of the face and then feeding those features to a classifier. So then we can say, okay, we've given information only about the eyes, only about the nose, only about the mouth and so on, and we can extract and determine how significantly each particular feature contributes to the categorization of this task, this kind. Okay, so this is so we took a number of different computer vision algorithms, took a number of features derived from different parts of the face, and here's a kind of global summary of the performance. And what you can actually see is, first of all, humans are about 65% correct. And if you look at the best algorithms that we actually found, this is a particular deep network which is trained to recognize faces. And so what we do is we took the pre-trained deep network, which is already trained on face recognition, and we simply tuned the final classification layer to actually learn this task. And so that's the performance of this network. And you can see that it's almost as good as humans. But you can also see a bunch of other features which are actually also equally good. See, some of these are not even deep features. These are actually standard, like histogram of gradients and so on. So this is actually showing that even low-level features and even traditional sort of computer vision detectors can actually do reasonably well on this. But the question that we were really interested in is looking at the error patterns. That is, what we said is, let's take the ability of humans to recognize all these different faces in our database, and then correlate that with the ability of computers to do the same thing on the database. So the question is, you get a confidence score from the computer, you can get a percentage score of how many people actually consistently agree with that classification. We looked at the correlation of these two. And what is very surprising to us is that if you look at the last bar, this is actually humans agreeing with humans. So humans are very, very consistent with each other, regardless of which region you're from and which age you're in and which gender you are and all that. People are really consistent on this task. That is, their performance is highly correlated. But if you look at all the other algorithms, actually their performance or correlation with human error patterns is very, very low. And this is the case even if you try to train these algorithms to predict the human actions. What this means is that the underlying feature representations used by computer vision algorithms are actually a whole range of these computer vision algorithms. All the feature representations seem to be quite different from what humans are apparently using, as judged by the difference in the error patterns. That is, the faces that are very highly accurately classified by human beings are not the faces that are actually classified by the computer vision. So that's the finding in this study. So what we can compare is that we have actually compared now humans and machines on a hard task, and this shows a very consistent and systematically different error, suggesting that the underlying features are very different between computers and what humans are using. Okay. The second then question is, can we go beyond comparing? Because of course this is only the final output, and in any computer vision system or even in the human visual system, there's a representation stage and there's a classification stage. And so what we've done here is to compare performance, but the question is, can I actually compare the features that are being used? And so here, what we do is we need a way to actually understand the feature representation that is inside the thing. So the question is, how do we do it? Well, it turns out that there's one of the issues that we need to sort of address first. So if I take any set of features that are given by a computer vision algorithm, and then I get a set of neurons or set of features that I can get from the brain, then how, there's no one-to-one mapping between the neurons in a neural network, two neurons in the brain. There's no way to align these things. And so you can imagine that what you get from a deep network might be something like this, the blue axis. And what you got from the human brain might be just a rotation of these. So then you can't really align them. The fact that there's no alignment between these two doesn't mean that they're not actually correlated. What you really need to do is to go from looking at sort of the feature representations to actually the distances between these. And so basically what you want to do is to compare the distances between different objects. And so then that frees you up from the alignment problem. And you can directly compare sort of distances between different features or different images in the representation with the distances in another level. So that's what we want. But then still, the problem is still, how do you actually measure distances in perception, not distances in the brain? Well, if you want to look at distances in perception, turns out there's actually a very nice and intuitive task that you can use to measure distances in perception. And so here's the task. The scene here contains a leopard. So raise your hand if you can find the leopard, and I'll tell you what principle that is that this illustrates. I'll wait for a couple of hands to come up. Right. So okay, so the leopard is actually sitting here, and it's really remarkable, right? And first of all, couple of things. The leopard has evolved to be hidden in the surroundings like this because the markings on its body are actually breaking. They're sort of preventing it from being grouped into a single object. So there's a kind of camouflaging it. The leopard has evolved not to be hidden from us, but it's actually evolved to be hidden from deer and its other prey. And so this also suggests that our visual systems are all very similar because even we are getting fooled by the same process, right? But the principle here is really that the leopard has actually evolved for its body to be similar to its surroundings. And so that if you take a long time to find some object in a cluttered scene, then it means that that object is actually very similar to the surroundings. Okay, and this is the essential principle of visual search, which is that you can take the time taken to find an object as a measure of the index of similarity between the object and its surroundings. And so we take this principle from a very interesting scene like this to a kind of more boring display like this which we use in our lab, where the essential principle is still the same. That is, the time taken for you to find the odd one out is a measure of the similarity of the target and the distract. So for any two images, I can perform such an experiment. And if I do the experiment, I can get a measure of similarity between between these two items. And if I do this for lots and lots of items, I can create a sort of big set of measurements which represent the distances in perception. Okay, and so if you look at perceptual distances in humans, you can take a lot of different images. So these are all the different kinds of images, and then we measure the perceived distances between these images, using a visual search. And so that gives us measures of similarity. And if you invert those measures of this similarity, you get a measure of dissimilarity. So that gives us a measure of distance between every pair of images. What do you do for a computer vision system? That's pretty easy because you can access the feature vectors inside. And so you can actually measure you can take out the feature vectors and any layer of representation or the underlying representation. And then you can just simply measure the Euclidean distance between these features. So now the stage is set to be able to compare the distances in perception with distances in computer vision. With distances in any computer vision sort of model or any computer vision system. Right? So that's what we did. And so what we're doing here is actually we're plotting the predicted distance from computer vision models against the observed distances in perception. So the y-axis is human vision and the x-axis is actually the computer vision distances. And it turns out that the best possible model for predicting the perceptual distances is some kind of combination of features from all different computer vision models we tested at that time. And what was interesting to us in this plot was actually not the fact that there's a good correlation, because a good correlation makes sense anyway, because if two images are very similar, anyway, perceptually very similar, and in any representation very similar, and they're very, very dissimilar, they'll anyway be a dissimilarity. So the correlation is kind of expected. What is actually more interesting to us were the deviations. So the deviations here refer to the couple of pairs of objects where there were lots of pairs of objects which are either under-predicted or over-predicted. And so then the question is, what are those particular pairs? And we started looking at these pairs, and basically these are the pairs which are overestimated in the sense that the predicted distance is actually more than the observed distance. And these pairs, if you look at them, these are usually objects which are sharing either the viewpoint, the same object at multiple viewpoints, or it could be mirror images and so on, which are actually kind of perceptually known to be similar, and they're not being captured by the computer vision systems as much as they should. The other set of distances are actually underestimated pairs, where the observed perceptual distance is actually larger than the predicted distance. And one very interesting category that we actually found is this is objects which are actually symmetric. What we found is that the perceived distance between symmetric objects is actually much more than predicted from computer vision models. And it turns out that all computer vision models, at least the one we tested at this time, actually show the same. And so what we then thought is, well, this is one clear bias that we actually observe between computer vision models and human vision. So let's see if I can actually incorporate symmetry as a feature into a computer vision algorithm and see if it improves performance. And so what we did was shown here. So we take an image and we extract the features using a standard pre-trained deep network. But we also extract symmetry features, which are actually symmetry scores, which are actually obtained on every possible axis. And then what we said is, can we augment these two features to actually improve the performance of a deep? And these are deep networks which are already trained for saturation on some databases. And the question is, can we still get an additional boost in performance by including symmetry features? And it turns out the answer is basically yes, we get small but significant increase in performance. Okay, so that shows that you can take a bias, you could sort of discover a bias in computer vision algorithms, fix it, and fixing it can actually improve performance. Okay, so that's the second part of the talk. Not sure how much time. 30. Right? So then the next part of the talk is, well, can we actually go further? Because here we looked at these kind of quantitative differences. Can we go to something where we can say, okay, do deep networks actually see the way? And so here's how we set up the study. This is work done by Georgian, Harish, and Pramod, who are in the lab. All three of them are out in different interesting other places. So the question we wanted to ask is, suppose I had some measure that compared humans and machines, and the machine showed small bias which is different from humans. Then typically, if the performance is close to humans but not exactly there, you typically say, well, let's just throw more data at the algorithm, let's just train it better, and then we should recover the gap because that's just a matter of training or extra data. But suppose we found a measure by which actually machines actually show the opposite trend as humans. Then you can't solve this problem by actually just adding more data or increasing the amount of training. You need to actually fundamentally change something. So that is our logic, that in this case, you have a quantitative difference between a human and a machine. But let's look for also qualitative differences, where actually the machine pattern might be completely opposite to what humans do. And so we set out to actually test a bunch of properties which are known to be present in humans. And then we said, okay, let's see if those properties are actually there in machine vision algorithms. Okay. So this is the way we do it. So let me take one example and show you. And we actually tested a number of these in our study and published sort of all of those together. So here's one example. And this is actually a very famous effect called the Thatcher effect. And this refers to the fact that these two images look pretty normal to us when they're inverted. But if you actually turn them upside to the right side up, these two are actually, there's a very grotesque difference between these two images. Okay. And it's the same two images. It's really amazing. I mean, even though I have so much knowledge of this Thatcher illusion, I still completely fail, completely see the illusion, because no amount of extra knowledge about it actually kills the illusion. The vision is quite robust to all your to any other variations. Yeah. So what does this actually illusion mean? What we decided is that this effect is a very well-known effect, but what it actually means is it's a statement about distances in perception. So what do I mean by statement about distance in perception? Well, if it is the case that upright faces, the same two upright faces, they'd be actually more dissimilar to each other than inverted faces, then you would be confusing these two images and actually not confusing these two images. So you find a very big difference between these two images in one orientation, but not in the other. So really, this is a statement about actually the perceptual distances between these images. Okay, and so the moment you convert this effect into a perceptual distance, you can then compare this in a deep network or any other computer vision algorithm by simply saying, what is the Euclidean distance between the feature representations of the upright faces and the inverted faces? So if the upright face distance is more than the inverted faces, it means that the deep network also has a Thatcher. Okay, so that's basically what we did. We looked at We took the distances between the upright faces and inverted faces, and we calculated some kind of index. And the index will be positive if it's like a human being. So basically, if you look at this plot, then this is actually what we're plotting for a convolutional neural network across all the layers. And so what we're doing here is to plot the Thatcher index. And if you see the standard VGG16 object detection network, it's trained on objects, not on faces. What you see is actually a Thatcher index that sort of becomes briefly positive in some layers, but then finally it's actually negative. So in other words, this particular deep network, at least the final layer of representation, final representational layer actually does not experience a Thatcher effect. In fact, it's the opposite. Okay. But if you take a deep network that is actually trained on faces, the same VGG architecture, but trained on face recognition, you do see a Thatcher. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward and intuitive, right? Because you train the deep network on face recognition. These are upright faces, and so it makes sense that the categorization on or the distances between upright faces is more than the distances between inverted faces. So this is one case where humans are showing the same effect as deep networks are on this particular kind of qualitative observation. Okay. Let me show you one case where deep networks actually don't show the same trend as humans, and this is a case. This is a phenomenon called the global advantage. So what happens here is when people are shown an image like this, they can report the global form much faster than the local form. So in other words, here it's a square made of circles, and humans can actually report the circle much faster than the square. Okay, so this has given rise to this very popular saying that we see the forest before we see the trees. Okay, so we see the global structure first, and then you see all the local details. So again, the phenomenon is reported in that way, but actually it's a statement about distances and perception, right? So what is the statement about distances and perception? Well, here's the precise statement. What we think is happening is if you take two shapes which are made of squares, but you make different arrangements out of them. So here's a circle made of squares and a square made of squares. Then the distance between these two shapes, which don't differ in local shape, but differ in only the global shape, will be actually larger than the equivalent change which is at the local level, but not at the global. So here, these are two circles, one made of squares and one made of circles. So the same change in shape is there in both cases. In one case, the global shape has changed, but the local shape has not. The other case, the local shape has changed, but the global shape has not. And so the question is, what is the relative distance between these two? Okay, and we know that in humans, and we tested it in humans as well, that humans actually show a bigger change here than over here. Okay, so then we tested for this effect in a deep network. And basically, this is the global advantage index. And basically, what you see here is something quite surprising. The shaded region is what humans actually show. And what you can see is that in the standard VGG16 architecture, and we tested it on a number of different feed-forward networks as well, they all show the same effect. They all show a local advantage, which is that they're very, very sensitive to a local feature change, but they're not sensitive to an arrangement. They're not really sensitive to the arrangement of features in it. Okay, and this is consistent with the observations of sort of a texture bias in deep networks and other kinds of things where they're known to be showing very extreme sensitivity to local features. Okay, and so somehow deep networks are showing much more sensitivity to local features than humans are showing. And if you look across all the properties that we've tested, we found a bunch of yes answers and a bunch of no answers. And so what this means is that there's some properties which actually humans show and deep networks show, and actually bunch of deep networks, bunch of computation algorithms. And actually there's a bunch of properties that humans have, but deep networks don't have. And so then the idea is that this is a kind of signature of all the processing that's happening in the deep network, and potentially you can target these particular phenomena and maybe train networks to actually have this kind of property and check whether they have this property and so on. So this is a kind of general approach that you can use to compare perception and what happens in machines. Okay. So that's that study. So if you compare machine and human perception, this can actually reveal sort of qualitative differences between machine and human perception. And so for the final part of my talk, I'm going to talk about a completely different technique where we've been trying to interrogate vision happening at the level of single units. And so here, these are animal experiments, because this is the only way that we can actually access information of that kind. No human would allow us to put electrodes into their brain. And so basically what we're doing is to investigate this kind of detailed processing in animal models. And so this is the way our experiment works. We have an animal, in our case a monkey, which has been trained to actually look at images on a screen. And so just for looking continuously at those images and not turning its head away, they get a juice reward. Okay, and for the juice reward, they're willing to come and do the task. They do hundreds of trials, and we can, while they're looking at those images in the task, we can measure the response in the visual processing regions in the brain. And so what I'm showing you here is now, this is the brain inside, and of course, we insert an electrode into the brain, and the electrode is implanted into a particular region in the visual cortex called the inferior cortex. This is a region which is known to be important for object recognition, because if you remove this region in animal experiments, animals show profound deficits in object recognition. If you have damage because of stroke in this part of the brain in human beings, humans actually experience a condition called agnosia, where they cannot recognize objects. They can touch the object, they can't name the object, they don't know what it is. Okay. There's also a condition called prosopagnosia, where it's called face blindness, where people with this condition cannot recognize faces. They can't distinguish between faces. They know it's a face. It's a little bit like if you look at animals in the zoo. You can see a bunch of lions and they all look similar to you. And that's sort of what a prosopagnosia patient experiences for human faces. So this is a very interesting kind of disorder. And these are disorders of perception where the optics of the eye are completely normal. And it's really a processing deficit of the visual regions in the brain. Okay, so what we're doing now is to record from these regions in the brain in the animal, in the monkey. And we're recording, and a good way of recording, you get a signal like this, where the action potentials are signals produced by individual neurons, and you can recognize these, you can actually detect these action potentials and then understand what individual neurons are actually processing. Okay. What I'm going to show you now. So what I'm going to show you now is actually the recreation of a recording that we've done in our lab at IISC. Like images. It also responds to a couple of inanimate objects as well. So what people have found, and this is not our finding exclusively, but what people have found is that if you record from hundreds of neurons in this region, you can actually perform object recognition almost at very high performance. And so we know that the representation or the responses that neurons produce in this region are sufficient to actually perform any kind of visual task. Okay. So the question that we wanted to ask is, well, what makes our brain so good at recognizing distorted letters? Remember, there are captures that I showed you in the beginning. And so when you look at these captures, how is the brain actually representing these letters? And actually, very importantly for us, these are animals that have never been trained to look at these letters, discriminate these letters, or anything at all. So what we're looking at is sort of the baseline representation of these letters without any training. There's no training to learn to read or discriminate or anything like that. Okay. And the premise that we actually had is the reason why we're actually so good at distorted letters is because we're so good at distortions anyway. Because when an object rotates in its viewpoint in the real world, those objects undergo distortions. And those distortions are actually something that we're anyway good at. And so the hypothesis was that actually because we're so good at recognizing objects across different viewpoints, sizes and positions and so on, our brain is anyway good at actually decoding distorted letters. Okay, and so the question is, what is the nature of the representation that actually gives rise to our ability to recognize distorted letters? And so this is the experiment. And so what we actually wanted to look at is we presented a bunch of strings at a bunch of distortions. And so what we wanted to investigate in particular is whether the representation that we get from the brain in this part of the brain is actually separable or not. So in other words, the response to a particular string at a particular distortion we wanted to know whether the response can be separated into the response to the string alone and to the response to the distortion alone. Okay, so that was one question. Similarly, we also wanted to know what happens when you see a series of letters. When you see a bunch of letters together, the question is how is the response to that bunch of letters related to the individual neural responses to the individual letters. So then the question is again, do you have a separable response where the response to multiple letters can be broken down into the neural responses to the individual letters, or is it not separable in the sense that it's not you can't break down the response to multiple letters. Okay, so those are the two questions we asked. So here are the results. So here's one cell, and what I'm showing you here is the response to 8 letters of that cell. The response of that cell to 8 letters presented at multiple different positions in the visual field, but also at multiple distortions. And this is the predicted response we got from this separable model. And so the question really what we wanted to know is there any kind of separability in the response to letters at different positions and different distortions? Okay, and basically what we see, and this is what is shown here, is that we find that the neural response to distorted letters is actually a product, but not the sum of the individual shape tuning, the letter tuning, and the distortion tuning. So here we get a particular direction of result, which is the response to distorted letters, is the product of the response to the individual letter times the distortion that the letter is experiencing. This is a kind of multiplicative response. Okay. We got a completely different pattern when we look at the response to multiple letters. Actually, I'll sort of just run through this. And what we find here is the response to letter strings is actually a sum of the responses to the individual letters, but not the product. So we actually kind of have a double dissociation, right? So we have two rules that actually come here. One is the response in the brain to distorted letters is actually the product of the response to letter and the product of the response to letter and distortion. And the response to multiple letters is a sum but not the product of the single letter response. So what this shows is that there are two very interesting kind of rules which are being used. Both are separable rules because one concerns multiplication of two independent components and the other contains addition of two independent components. Both ways it's separable according to this. So then the question is, if you have a representation like this, and there may be small deviations which are present in the neurons in the brain which are causing this the brain to anyway represent distorted letters better. But the question is, can I encode these two rules in an artificial system? And is that sufficient to get captured? And so this is what we actually set out to do. So we took artificial neurons. They have some kind of letter tuning, and we imbued them with tuning for letters which is multiplicative or additive, and tuning for distortions which are again multiplicative or additive, and check all possible combinations. And after imbuing these artificial neurons with these properties, we wanted to check whether I can decode the identity of the letters well or not. Okay. And so basically, this is what we find. We find that if you take neurons or artificial neurons which have additive encoding of strings, we see very good performance. And those neurons actually need to have multiplicative encoding of distortions. So it's exactly these two rules that actually give you almost perfect capture data. And so what this shows is that you need to have these two rules, and these two rules are sufficient to give you very good capture data. So now the question is, given that these two rules are followed in neurons in the brain, do we see these rules spontaneously emerge in deep networks which are trained for word recognition in natural science? And so that's what we checked. And it turns out that this is exactly what we see in deep networks. I'm not going to go through the individual results, but basically what we see is that if you take a bunch of deep networks, all of them are trained on character and word recognition. We find that those deep networks actually show additive encoding of letters in a string and multiplicative encoding of distortions. So this is exactly the same rules that we observe in neurons in the brain. And therefore, we think that this is a sort of general rule that these networks need to learn, and that the brain has also learned to actually solve this topic. Okay, so that's sort of what we have at the end. And I'll wrap up by thanking all of you for your attention. All the amazing people that are working in our lab. People in our lab come from very different backgrounds, both from biology as well as engineering, and we keep getting people who are interested in this kind of work. So please do get in touch if you are interested, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Maybe one or two questions?
Yeah.
If you can please come to the slide where you have the properties, the 3D depth ordering.
This one?
No, previous, much before. Yeah, even before. You have a table with the properties not achieved by a deep neural network.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Sorry. I guess that's some ways of.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
So, because we know in deep neural network, the filters in a CNN are learned from the data.
Right.
So, is it possible that if you do an experiment where we gradually increase the amount of training data, if I will get achieve one of these properties, one after the other?
So I think so, but I think maybe that's the kind of thing that we've also thought that you may have some initial training, which is this general object categorization, and then maybe you have some extra training that you will give to acquire some of these properties.
Yeah.
But we're not quite sure. I mean, we're not experts in this in training networks. We're experts at we're sort of our core expertise is in querying a system for all the properties that they have. So, but I'd be happy to sort of talk more in detail.
Yeah, because maybe this list is dynamic in the sense that maybe to throw in more data, it would more
Potentially,
examples.
So at least at the time when we actually published the study, we checked all possible feed-forward deep neural network architecture, including the ResNet and so on. So those seem to all have the same kind of properties.
Problems, yeah.
But nowadays, of course, we haven't tested the latest ones like the transformer architectures and things like that, where potentially these properties are already there. Or
But
not there.
they are recurrent.
Right, so again, yeah, I think that's again, every time there's sort of a big announcement of a vision network or something, we should be checking these properties in a way. And potentially the gaps in the performance of that network, I mean, it's still unproven, right, whether the gaps in the performance in the real world tasks are related to these properties. Because these properties might be arising in the human visual system because of training on other tasks. Right, so for example, if you look at one of the yes answers, there's something called Weber's law. And the Weber's law refers to the fact that your sensitivity to changes in the features actually is proportional to the size of the feature. And so that's a pretty interesting property which I would have expected to be arising because of training on object category. So this gives us a kind of general recipe that I can take a network, take a data set, and depending on the task, you can check what properties are actually arising because of training on networks. But I think there's a sort of, I mean, it gives an interesting way to look at a lot of different ways of querying deep networks and understanding what they do, but we haven't done further updates on this.
Yeah. Also, the basic question would be whether it's a structure related issue or.
That's right, exactly. So that's also another very important question. So you take the architecture and you put as much data as you want and you don't get these properties, or is it just a matter of just training on more data, or is it something where you need to change the architecture?
So there is a problem in deep learning theory, which is called a separation problem, which says that there are some functions which can be achieved by a network of this size,
Right,
but cannot be achieved by a network smaller than this.
I see. That, I mean, it'd be great to know like whether how these map onto some of these things. So that would be thank you for this question.
I have two small queries. One of them you have shown a camouflage picture
Right.
of the vector. In that case, the camouflaging, you were saying that the visual distance, there's something, some measures.
Yeah.
Which is similar or dissimilar, whatever. it is.
Yeah.
But my question is, the camouflaging, whatever I have read so far, the camouflaging can only be done when there is a color.
So
In black and white, it cannot be a camouflage.
oh no, that's you can have camouflage which is really effective in black and white. In fact, actually color improves the, I mean, color is actually detrimental to camouflage in certain cases. Because
I have seen some examples.
yeah.
There is a project going on in the US.
Uh-huh.
That is decamouflaging of the empty objects.
Okay. Yeah.
So where all the web machines
Yeah.
are being wrapped by a net
Right.
with grids and this.
Yeah.
When it makes them black and white.
Yeah.
Inside objects are clearly seen.
Okay.
So their
Yeah.
theory is that for color blind persons, camouflaging is a very difficult task
Right.
compared to normal.
So actually, so there's a bunch of dimensions you've touched upon. So one of the issue is that if you look at object recognition abilities on colored images versus black and white, people show almost highly correlated performance on these two. It's actually where color seems to really matter is in terms of segmentation, quick segmentation of like important properties, like say fruit on a tree and. But actually color vision varies a lot across animals, whereas I think form vision doesn't really vary so much.
No, my question,
That's
my
one
question was
for-
that,
and
is there a different measure of visual distance for color? Like,
Well, so empirically, the way we would do it is to actually repeat the experiment on the black and white versions and color versions of the same image. And if you see a very big difference in the performance, then you would imagine that that's because of color. Yeah, but those are ways of querying the system.
second
One
thing
is
is
better.
very small question that is about the visual aggregations, what you have shown.
Right.
So there, if the local pattern is getting changed.
Right.
Even that I follows a continuity route rather
Yeah.
than a sharp turn or something like this.
Yeah.
Why this?
So first of all, the eye movements don't follow that pattern. So you could be just fixating on a particular location and you'll still appreciate the global structure. I mean, neurophysiologically, I mean, there are neurons in the visual system that actually aggregate over larger and larger regions, just like in the networks where you have the later layers having larger field of view. But we don't quite understand exactly how this process of aggregation happens. In fact, I'm not even sure it's a process of aggregating all the individual pieces. It's more like a just kind of thing where and there's some kind of low spatial frequency information that is just being digested at once. I don't think there's a kind of I don't think there's a process of grouping one of these together. Although in the early stages in the visual system, it looks like there's a grouping, but actually in the later stages, it's an instantaneous.
So before the mic reaches there, so what is the definition of distance here? I mean, in your talk,
Yeah.
89 times you mentioned 18,
Right.
it's distance,
Right.
and once you said Euclidean distance.
Right, so we've done some work on that, so the time taken to search for an oddball target in a perceptual experiment. We've taken as a measure of we consider that to be a measure of similarity. But actually, when we check the mathematical properties, whether it's actually behaving like a distance metric, it turns out that the reciprocal of that time behaves very much like a distance metric. And so in that sense, we check the properties of a mathematical distance. For example, it roughly satisfies symmetry. It also roughly satisfies the triangle inequality and so on. So there's a kind of structure to that distance which we try to characterize. So that is in the case of perceptual distance. We've also shown that if you take the net distance between two items, let's say, for example, you have a line which is differing in curvature as well as orientation. Then the net distance between two lines that differ in both curvature and orientation is actually the L1 distance between the curvature and the orientation element. So it's actually like, it appears to be that the perceptual distance, I guess the perceptual space actually is governed by the L1 metric and not L2. We've actually checked between L1 and L2 and it's remarkable that it actually follows the L1 metric. But of course, in the case of computer vision, like, you could apply any distance metric between two feature vectors, and we've not really seen that kind of difference.
Maybe the last question.
Look.
Yes, so,
Thank you.
Now, the thing is that both of them are structurally as well as very different. Sure. Basically, I'm going through a paper now where they
Yeah.
project that how they respond to the cycle.
Yeah.
Now, I think that the basic neurons that are clear.
Yeah.
Play a role in the performance of this differentiation.
So I guess the way I'll answer that is that if you look at the early stages of the deep network representations, like the early convolutional stages, you can actually see that there is a kind of edge filtering going on, which is very similar to what Huber and Kiesel described in the early stages of the visual system, like the human visual system and biological vision. So that mapping has been observed. That there's a kind of coarse correspondence between the early stages of the visual system in our brains versus the visual system that you see in the convolutional network layers. So that's a very rough correspondence. I don't think people have actually characterized more detailed things like complex cells, and I mean there are other kinds of cells that people have where people have actually characterized in the biological, in biological investigations, which are not. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the biophysical structure, I mean, the biophysical computations that are possible by a real neuron, a real biological neurons are, they're much more complicated than the neurons that are present in the deep networks. So the deep network neurons are actually a very, very coarse approximation to what real neurons can do. And there's a lot of work that people do at that level to characterize the biophysical dynamics and general dynamics and the learning and so on. So there's a lot of things that are different in that sense. And it's almost like, I mean, one is faced with the puzzle of saying which difference do I need to account for? Because if you look at comparing the visual system like that, and even neurons like that, there's so many differences between them. I mean, even down to the fact that like real neurons have sodium channels, potassium channels, calcium channels, they have receptors, they have dynamics of receptors. There's a lot of complexity. So we don't know. I don't think we know like which detail to actually take into account. Even a single neuron has lots of details. And a single biological neuron, for example, synapses gets inputs from almost 20,000 other neurons. It sends outputs to 10,000 other neurons. So that, I mean, the amount of connectivity is huge. The number of neurons is also huge. So there's too many differences actually in that sense.
Yeah, I think let's thank the speaker once again. Any other question?
Did you find the external distortions? For example, there is a well-known school of thought that the deep neural networks, they rely more on textural information, whereas the human brain relies more on the shaping.
That's consistent with what we see.
That is consistent with what you say. And the other small question is that when you are talking of perceptual distance, actually, if you consider the geometric illusions, for example, like modal line illusion, where you directly can see how the distance measure is getting distracted for a human observer.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So how does the deep neural networks perform in such?
So actually, we considered at the time of doing the study, what we did was take all possible sort of perceptual phenomena and try to see if any of them could be converted into statements about the distances between those nodes. And in the case of the Muller layer illusion, it was not very straightforwardly clear to us because in humans, when you ask people to report the two lines, what you'll say is, can you tell if the height of the line is the same? Now, the same kind of task, it wasn't clear to us how we would query a deep network to actually do this task without training. So I think we have to figure out some ways of doing this in such a way that you can actually query the internal activations of the deep network and then say, okay, the deep network is experiencing middle layer illusion or not. Similarly, there's some brightness illusions also. There's some great illusions actually. I mean, it's the amazing. I mean, it's sort of amazing work by psychologists to control for image features, but still produce like interesting illusions. And so those cases also, we weren't sure how to convert them into statements about like the feature vectors or the activations in the network. So we didn't go there, but I think there's important work to be done there to say, okay, at the network activation level, what do you mean by experiencing the brightness illusion or the size illusion or something else? And there are ways in which we're trying to do that for some size illusions, but we've not done it for every one of them. And it's not very altogether clear to me how to query those. But we would like to actually do that kind of query because when they're recording from neurons in the visual system, in the monkey brain or for that matter, even the human brain, we would like to know without the organism actually telling us its own percept, what do you mean by the neural instantiation of it? And so that's an important sort of work to be done in terms of querying the representations, and it could be that many types of representation give rise to the same illusion also.
It's yeah, we can try this.
Yeah.
Thanks for the thanks once again.
Thank you, Professor Arun, for the enlightening talk. And thank you, Professor Mukherjee, for chairing the session for us. I'll request Professor Mukherjee to please felicitate Professor Arun with the memento. And request Professor Kuntal Ghosh of Indian Statistical Institute to please come to the stage and felicitate Professor Mukherjee with a memento. So we now take a short break. From 4 p.m. we have 3 parallel technical sessions, one here at BJP and 2 others will be held at NAB 1 and NAB 2 of Governance Level. So the presenters of the technical session are requested to reach to their respective venue and submit their presentation to the volunteers. Thank you.